session today, we're going to do a brief introduction to productivity. We're then going to look at what productivity is and is not. We're going to look at some productivity benchmarks that we've developed over the years. And we're going to then, because a lot of people tell me they don't have to measure productivity because they sell on design value, we're going to take a look at that idea of productivity and design value. And then the real guts of it is productivity in people. How do we actually help people become more productive? And that's what the mainstay of this presentation will be. At the end of it, we've got an action plan for you on how to actually implement the stuff that we've talked about. Poor old productivity's had a bad rap as a word. It's been touted as a killer of creativity in design studios. And while we have a lot of respect for Mr. Baker and Mr. Enns, who both state that you shouldn't bother measuring hours. And that may well be the way it works best in the United States. But we know from running a design studio here for more than 20 years and from now working for more than about 15 years with a lot of hundreds of design studios across the country, measuring productivity and getting it into the studio is vital to your survival. So we're trying to take away that bad rap for productivity. The people at Streamtime, and we'll state right up front, we're not getting anything back from Streamtime when we do mention them, but we do support them because they're Australian and because they support our industry. So they fund Never Not Creative. They do a great job of that. And so we support Streamtime by talking about them. They, some time ago, said that they were against logging hours, and they introduced a really neat looking to-do Kanban style screen where you stack up the jobs up the top, and then as you do them, you drag them below the line. That in the background records the hours and the time on the job. So even though people like Streamtime were saying they don't record hours, the system actually does do it. It just looks like it's a much nicer way of recording it. And it is. It's much more user-friendly for designers. The other thing about productivity I'll stress is that it applies to every design business, whether you're a solo operator or whether you employ 100, particularly if you employ 100. But it's also critical for a sole operator or very small businesses. We've obviously been around this industry for a long time. More recently, we've seen prior to COVID, we were seeing people 10, 15, 20 years in the industry popping up and saying, look, I'm burnt out, I've had enough. And I'm sure many of you have come across people like that. Maybe some of you feel that way. Since COVID, that period of burnout is dropping. We're finding people that have only been in business 5 to 10 years burnt out. And it really does relate to how you think about productivity in your business. So considering productivity is important for sole operators all the way through to large operators. And whilst we said in our promos that it isn't about all about counting hours, it isn't, but you still have to count the hours. We still have to account for them. Really what we're looking at with productivity is how do we use productivity measures to look at our team and work out how they can do it better, how they can be more productive in what they're doing. So we then ask the question, why count? Well, if you take a look at all the businesses as we do, so we get right into a lot of these businesses, and we are able to see exactly how much money is being spent on what. The reality is most design businesses are spending between 60 and 70% of their expenses on salaries. So there's no business out there that wouldn't turn around and say, well, what am I getting back for that 60 or 70% of my expenses? How do I measure? I know what's going in because I'm paying salaries. I've got people sitting there for the regulated time, but what's coming out? How do I actually measure it? So that's why it's important that we do the measurement. Just a little aside here. One way to actually look at salaries and billings and productivity is if you can get billings that are 3 times the size of your salary bill, you're going to have a very financially successful design business. So that's a target. It's not easily attained, but certainly that's a target that we know will guarantee a very financially successful design business. So to wrap it up, productivity is really about survival. You're not going to survive as a business and personally for that matter, as we're seeing with burnout, if you don't measure productivity, look at it the right way and then act on it. The key there is to actually measure it. So you have to measure productivity to enable to manage it. And that's not that hard to do. This poor guy here is looking very distraught at the idea of having to measure productivity, but really you can do it with just a simple billings check. So what's actually being billed back to the client and a job P&L. If you do those 2 simple activities, the end of each week, and if you need to use a studio management bit of software to make it nice and quick and easy to do, you will know how you're going in terms of productivity. You'll know where the issues are and aren't in productivity. And we're going to look a lot more at that. So just what is productivity? Well, the very nice economists out there, they define it, this is great, effectiveness of productive effort measured in terms of the rate of output per unit of input. It's no wonder people hate the word productivity. But in fact, we don't see it that way at all. We've got a much more balanced and realistic interpretation of how we define productivity. So we're looking at it as hours billed to the client. That's the mechanical bit. That's the bit that needs the billing systems and the hour recording systems and the job task systems. So we take that, we accept that, we've got to do that, but the big bit is the team wellbeing. There is no sense in spending all your time labouring over how many hours you can bill back to a client and checking on people and all the rest of it. If the team wellbeing isn't there, you'll have high staff turnover. You'll develop a bad reputation in the industry. You may find it's harder to get employees, and certainly at the moment, with near to full employment in the design space, if you're not offering a good wellbeing program within the studio, then you're going to have trouble finding people. So the team wellbeing is the critical part about it. And that's what we want to stress today. Productivity is all about the team. So let's take a look at some productivity benchmarks. 30-second encapsulation. We've got 48 weeks we can work in a year. We've got 5 days with mandated working, gives us 240 days. You take away the mandated public holidays, you end up with 230 around that working days, depending on which state you're in. You're working 7 3/4, 8 hours a day, which is again, the accepted level. So it gives you about 1,840 working hours a year for an individual. Now, the next bit we work on is the productivity rate, which we say as a standard in Australia is 70%. If you're reading any of David C. Baker or Blair N's material, they're talking about 60% in the US. But we know as a standard, as a benchmark across this country, 70% is right. And we also know if you do all your calculations on 70% and then you get the work in, you can actually run a profitable design business. But that really means you've got 1,288 billable hours a year. You take your annual expenses, and what we've done here is in the last session, we showed a budget for a 3-person business with 3 partners all earning the same sort of money, and they had an annual expenses of 516. They have a possible billable hours of 3,864, so they got $133 comes out as $134. You add a margin on top of that. You've got an hourly charge out rate. That's where you start your calculations on that. That's not necessarily what you're going to quote to clients. That's your starting point. But as long as you use that starting point on your margin, you're going to be safe. So let's pull that apart and let's look at what that means in terms of productivity. Well, what we do know is from research that the whole idea of only working 48 weeks in a year is increases productivity, because there's this boost for about 8 weeks leading up to a holiday where productivity increases. It's that anticipation of being able to take a break. Keeping it to 48 weeks in a year. Now, this is important for sole operators, because so many sole operators we talk to say, oh, look, I couldn't afford to take it. I just took a couple of weeks at Christmas. That's burnout material. That really is. You do need to discipline yourself to work only 48 weeks in the year. And later we're going to look at how you actually can reduce that as well. The 10 public holidays, last month I was queried on the fact that there are no sick leave days in there. When we do these calculations, they were based on 3 business owners who effectively said they didn't take sick leave, or they just muddled through. The reality is, in post-COVID, people are taking sick leave. It is having an impact in terms of the number of days people are having off, and so it should. It should always have, but it wasn't. But even if you add the 10 sick days leave in a year, it only adds $3 per hour to the cost rate. So look, when you do this formula for yourself, look at it, add in the sick leave days, and it's not going to make much difference to that bottom line. The 8 hours a day, that I know a lot of people who will say to us, well, yeah, we work 12, we work 14, whatever, we work whatever we have to work. What we know is as soon as you start to creep up over that 40 hours a week, you're damaging your health. And certainly the stats are showing us that once you get to 60, your health is at risk. And if you continue to do that over a long period of time, you're putting yourself at risk. So, and it basically doesn't add to productivity. There's some research around that shows registrars in hospitals who are regularly working 100 hours a week are actually performing as if they were legally drunk. So stick to the 8 hours per day. The 70% productivity, the thing about productivity is that if you start working longer weeks, your productivity will drop. We've experienced that ourselves, that once you get over 55 hours a week of work, your productivity really plummets. So there's no sense in doing it because you don't actually achieve the end result. Here's a benchmark for you. So when you're doing all your thinking, this is the minimum viable billing hours per person per year, 1288. Keep that in the back of your mind. So we end up with this $160 per hour charge out rate. Well, that's where we start our calculations, is on 160 per hour. It's a figure that is workable if you're in a small business, say 3, as this example is, 3 people who are all earning the same amount of money and doing the work to the same degree. And that 160 an hour works for that situation. So certainly a sole operator or 2 people, 2 partners working in a business, this formula works for you. But there is a more sophisticated formula. If you have a large pay gap between people, so those of you that are employing people, maybe you've got a junior in the studio and you've got a creative director or an owner, and there's a huge gap between what their salary, effective salary is at the top, and that person. So even as a business owner where you're drawing a weekly lower salary and you take a dividend, your effective salary is much higher than the junior in the studio. So there are formulas that allow you to work that out. And but the point about it is the salary will be setting an effective individual charge out rate. If you're paying somebody $160,000 a year, you should expect to get more out of them than the $60,000 a year, 65 junior. That's fair to expect that. And so what you need to do is set the targets accordingly. The other side of that is that we do note the productivity increases and how they lower that cost rate. So if you take these people from the most senior to the most junior, and you look at it and you work out the hourly cost rate for them at, what it is there, $140 an hour. If you can get that person down to an 80% product or up to an 80% productivity, this is the gain you're going to make. You're making around about $20 an hour or 28 hours a week. So there's huge increases to be had from moving productivity, increasing productivity. What we will say is that this top end, that is harder to do. So quite often in terms of productivity measures, the business owners aren't set a productivity rate. Their productivity is measured in how well they can have everybody else productive. And that's the same with the senior designers. Some senior designers who are managing a team of midweight and juniors, their productivity will be a bit lower because their job is to raise the productivity of the juniors. The design manager is the same. And really, while we set 70%, we do know that with juniors and midweights, you should fairly be expecting to get a much higher percentage. So the idea is you calculate it on 70%, your billings are actually going out and you're recouping as if they were working at 80, or when they are working at 85%. So that difference goes straight to your bottom line. And here's how it works. This is the difference it makes. So in that 3-person business, they had a revenue of $660,000, which there's a benchmark in there that you would expect to get $220,000 as a minimum revenue from each staff member. So you've obviously got to keep the work up to them, but if you're doing those billings at the 1288 and you're billing out with an appropriate hourly rate, that's the sort of return you're going to get for a 3-person business. Typically, that 3-person business will have expenses of about $520,000 because there's 3 sizable salaries in there. So they walk away with a gross profit of 140. If you can take that productivity up to 80%, the revenue goes up because you're actually producing more work. This obviously relies on you having more work, but you're producing more work and the revenue goes to 795 at 80%. If you then take away your expenses, you've nearly doubled your profit. So moving in that 3-person business, and this is a case study based on a business we worked with, part of our role with them was to help them get from 70% to 80% because they were looking to get a better profit. The thing about productivity is that most people think productivity really only relates to the hours you can bill back to a client. So bill more hours, you increase your productivity. That's true. That's the actual productivity. There's an apparent productivity increase you can achieve during estimating. So the idea is that a 10-hour job, you can actually take from 70% productive to 80% by adding an extra 2 hours onto it. So when you're estimating it to the client, you add 20% on. The hourly rates won't add a hell of a lot. So if you're looking at 160, it's going to add $320 onto the price of a 10-hour job. So the estimating in itself can give you an increase in productivity by allowing or costing to the client effectively at a higher rate. So think about that as that productivity starts back at the estimating stage. As I mentioned at the beginning, the whole idea of productivity in relation to selling design on value means that a lot of people say to us that I don't actually need to measure productivity. I don't need to count hours because we don't sell on hours. We're actually putting a value on it that is what the client values. And so we don't worry about that. The reality is that value costing for design is based on the idea that you're creating a level of value for the client. So the work you're doing adds value for the client. You've found a way that you can articulate that back to the client, but you communicate to the client the added value and you put a figure on it and the client accepts it. Now, what you need to know is how much of that value do I capture? How much do I keep? You can wait until the end of the project and have a look at it and see, and you can say, oh, well, I billed them 50,000 and look, not sure how many hours it took me in the studio because I don't record hours. So I'm not sure how much value I've actually captured. That's not value pricing. Let me tell you, that's not value pricing. That's a stab in the dark. You've got to work out how much of that value you're actually capturing. The only way you can do that is to sit down, you take the job, you go to the client, you convince the client it's worth 50,000. You look at it in the studio and you work out it's going to take 20 hours at $200 an hour, $4,000 is what it's going to take. You put the tasks together that make up that time. You put them into a system like Streamtime. You allocate the task to an individual or individuals. You ask them to just tell me how much time you're actually taking. In some of these systems, it's very easy to monitor that. At the end of it, you can sit back and look at it and say, yep, okay, I thought it would take 10 hours. It actually took 15. So that's a good learning for next time. And I captured X hours. I've made a good value pricing project. But until you do that, you don't know if you've actually captured any value from that project. So those who are costing on value, you still, to prove that you're actually getting the value out of it, you still need to do it. The point about value pricing is it offers a great opportunity for you to bring in revenue that allows you to make the decisions you want to make. It frees you up. Particularly if you're talking about something that costs you 4,000 and you're selling it for 20. Those sorts of margins allow you to sit back at some stage and say, all right, I'm going to take 3 weeks and I'm going to go off and learn this or that, or I need a refresher and so I want to take a month off. It's those wins that allow you to do that. But until you actually identify all that, you can't make those decisions. You can do it at the end of a year. You can look at the figures at the end of the year. But by the end of the year, what you don't know is which ones you captured the value from and where you actually created the value, because you're looking at a profit and loss as means of measuring it. The only true way to measure it is to have some system that helps you. So the point I'm making is you can't value price without working out your hourly rate and productivity. So the real guts of all this is in people and productivity. The reality is that with people and productivity, there is going to be timekeeping. It isn't what drives it all. It is what allows you to make the decisions and allows you to be able to be profitable and sustainable for the business to go forward. But you do need to do timekeeping. In explaining it to people, and this is where I think the issue is, that most people who are asked to do timekeeping will say that it decreases their productivity, it lowers their motivation. I think the explanation, and that's because of that word productivity, the explanation is that what we're actually doing is putting a value on what you do. So let's drop the word productivity and let's say we really want to understand the value that you add. It's if you're explaining it to somebody else, what's the value you add to the business and to the client? And we do need to know that. So the designers all want to know that they're adding value for their clients. And so placing the discussion around value rather than productivity shifts the thinking. And the only way, as we've just discussed, you can really measure value is to say, well, what did the client pay us? What did they gain in order to pay us? And hence, What did it take us to actually produce that? And there's a productivity, or there's a value gain in there. And so you can report back to people and saying, look, the value add we're doing for our clients and that value that we're capturing makes us a more sustainable business. It allows us to have the right sort of rewards to give to you. The hard-nosed explanation is that productivity measurement is about making a sustainable business. If you don't measure it, you can't actually manage it. So it makes a sustainable business. You want to stay employed? We need a sustainable business. You need to help us understand where the money's coming from and where it's going. And that's why we use timekeeping. The idea is that there's a number of things that you can do in this space. The first one is having the most appropriate rewards. The second is to set up a workflow that helps people get the job done. And in these two things, workflow, responsibility and accountability, in amongst all that, there's a hell of a lot of things you can be doing. Workflow shouldn't happen without job descriptions. Job descriptions have to define the responsibilities and accountabilities of everybody, and it should have KPIs. So it should say how much we're expecting you to bill each month. Managing workflow, responsibility and accountability are sort of very much part of productivity. There's other ways of looking at it as well. So we want to talk about an approach called production planning and play, which allows you to think about the types of activities you're doing in the business and how you can streamline them and make them more effective. And then we're going to look at how you actually activate some of this and what it means in terms of the bottom line. Appropriate rewards. The 3-person studio we spoke about, we did a budget with them and built all of the right factors into the budget. One of them was the expenses for staff well-being. And we obviously didn't show this budget to their accountant, but we listed pub lunches. So for the 3 of them, knock off each Friday, go and have a pub lunch. We allocated funds for that because that's the well-being of the staff. And you may be 3 owners or you may be 1 owner and you take yourself off to the pub with a friend. But you allocate that sort of expense justifiably. Conferences and travel. So we're in Melbourne, we've got the Knobs conference coming up, no bullshit, which is got an amazing lineup of people. So things like that, and the design conference, allocating funds so people can go to that. You're swapping it around so different people go different years, and it's built around people coming back and telling you what they've learned from it, and also jumping onto social media to tell everybody that you're out there learning more about the industry. So the conferences and travel allocation is important. The staff amenities with, the most basic things like having fruit in a fruit bowl. The big one, which is staff training and professional development. So maybe you've got somebody that wants to get more into writing to go with design. And so you send them off to Richie Meldrum's writing course to learn more about that. So the idea is you're developing their skills, and in developing their skills, you're actually often adding more skills that you can sell to a client. So there's, instead of the copywriting perhaps going out, it's done in-house where it's done at a much lower hourly cost rate, and you can recoup a much higher rate for it. So professional development is an investment in the business. And if you look at those figures, they're fairly typical of what you should be spending in a 3-person business. That's the rewards, that's the added rewards of over and above salaries that you're putting into place for people. Just as run-of-the-mill, this is just standard sort of practice. Put it in your budget, have it spill out on the hourly rate, which is why you do this. You do an expenses budget because it gives you a figure that you can then work out your hourly cost rate. So all this is built into the hourly cost rate. This is paid for by every client who pays you for every hour that you're working. It's not a cost to you, the business. It's part of what you're billing back to clients. And so you build this in it becomes automatic as part of what you're offering. It's just part of the general well-being of people working in the studio. The second part is what's a fair wage. Carol researched and wrote a publication called What's a Fair Wage, based on a lot of research and discussions with a lot of the placement agencies. We put that together with what we've seen in hundreds and hundreds of profit and losses where we've worked with people, and we came up with a recommended set of fair wages for designers. There's three components in a fair wage, and should first of all say a fair wage means both sides of the coin. It is that it's got to be fair to you, the business owner, but it's got to be fair to the person working for you as well. So the three factors are that they've got to have the experience that is outlined in the job description. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to be paid at that level. They've got to have the hard skills, which basically means they can actually produce what they're saying they can produce. That's your Photoshop and InDesign and what have you. Most importantly, they have to have the human soft skills. Unfortunately, an area that I don't think gets enough emphasis when people are talking about a fair wage, but if you're paying big bucks to somebody, you'd expect that they can explain what the design is all about, and they can communicate it to a client, they can communicate it to you and their colleagues, they can discuss it. So it's that soft skills that are important. All that needs to get built into a sort of a package. And what we've done is to say, well, look, the fair wage is going to be governed by the job description itself. It's going to be governed by the role and its purpose and the responsibilities. Within the responsibilities is a set of KPIs. And those KPIs will vary from one business to another. And that's all down to that percentage. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a difference once you get to certain levels like creative director and design director. Those KPIs will vary. So if you're managing other people, your 70% billable is actually going to be lower because your job is to actually raise the productivity level of others. Similarly, if you're in a new business development, you have a new business development role within what you do, which is quite common with a lot of creative directors, and certainly for a business owner, that new business development will actually lower the potential hours you can put into the business. So your productivity rate would be pitched lower. There's no formula that determines that. We've got some experience that we've sort of used across the years on what does and doesn't work and how you actually balance it all out. So there is a balancing act between that productivity of a creative director and the new business development dollars they bring in. That same thing applies in areas such as client service. Okay, so the point about it all, though, it's not just about the money. You can't make it all about the money in a small design studio. The vast majority of design businesses in this country are small. So there's two factors. Money's not always the greatest incentive. A good workplace is a big incentive. The type of work is a big incentive, that people get to do the sort of work they want to do as designers. The other is that all small businesses have got a built-in salary ceiling that they can't go above because there's a limit to what you can actually bill to clients and hence what you can actually pay staff. So the alternate rewards become even more important. Those add-ons that you can offer to people because you've built them into your base hourly rate are what makes the job more appealing. When you look at some of those alternative rewards, the key at the moment is flexibility. We're seeing so much around the work from home flexibility that people are asking for. It certainly is an issue for discussion at the moment in design studios. So being as flexible as you can in that space is important. But there's simple things like giving people a birthday off. That doesn't actually affect productivity. 5 days holiday a year, if you place those 5 days in the Christmas break when you are not going to earn any revenue anyway from them because the clients aren't there and there's really little for them to do, the actual revenue cost is totally minimal. You take a rostered day off a month, you can cover that very easily with the way that you estimate. So you say, all right, we will say that there's going to be a rostered day off every month. That's an X number of days. We build that back into the formula, and then the hourly rate tips out and it's $3 or $5 an hour more. And I know some of you are sitting there saying, but that's another $3, that's another $5. The fact is that for most clients, they're not going to pick on the fact that the job has cost $100 more. If it's a small job, it's cost $50 more. So the rostered day off a month, build it back into the formula so that it fits. There's also, I know in talking to studios that they have particular heavy periods in the year where they've got annual reports, for instance. And so a rostered day off during annual reports is not really all that useful for the studio owner. And so in the negotiations, that's you're sorting all of that out. And reward by investment, saying to somebody, yep, here's some money, you can fly to Brisbane, spend 3 days in Brisbane at the conference, we'll pay for your accommodation, airfares, off you go. But, we want this back from you. It's an investment. So what we're looking for is what you can bring back that can make our business better. These are rewards that people will latch on to. The other area that really needs to be looked at is workflow. And this is where your job system comes into place, is setting up a workflow. Even if you're a sole operator, getting a workflow in place, simple diagram like this, you can have them very complex, but just a simple diagram. Perhaps there's different workflows for different types of jobs. But what this is all about is that it's helping people understand what comes before them, what comes after them, what decisions do I need to make about what's being given to me before I hand it on. So it helps clarify for them the job that they're being given to do. And the interesting thing is the research has shown us that if the decision-making is hard, people will avoid it. Seems pretty logical. We know we do it ourselves, which means we then don't commit to it, which means we don't complete the task as well as we should. And that leaves the decision-making to others. People walk away feeling unsatisfied. So get a workflow together and start using it is part of this. There's different types of workflows. There's a collaborative workflow working in teams. There's a just get on and do it, which is the very basic jobs. There's directed teams. There's self-directed teams, and there's agile teams. Each of those have their own elements to them. What I'm saying here is when you do your workflow, think about the type of work you want to do. Perhaps you've got, as we've talked about in the past, pillars that you're working in, and you may say, right, well, for this client in this pillar, we really need a self-directed team approach, or we need an agile team approach because the client wants to be involved. So determining that approach first, then work out the workflow that comes on from it. But get it down and get it visualized is the key to it. The making it happen comes out of two things: studio management software, client communication software. Studio management software is critical to running your business. I don't know how many designers complain to me about clients complaining about fees who then turn around and won't pay for studio management software. The fact is, it's not expensive in the big picture. It is critical to your business. It'd be a bit like saying, I'm going to start a design studio, but I'm not going to pay Adobe license fees because it's too expensive. You just can't do it. And we feel the same about management software. It allows you to input a new client, track that client, estimate for that client, track the work that's gone into that job and who's done what, and to then invoice it and do the circular 360 and look at it and do a job profit and loss. It is critical to understanding your business, and it is dead essential to productivity measurement. Client communication is another thing where email, I think, is a highly inefficient way of communicating with clients. You're much better off looking at things like Slack, where you can confine the discussion with a client and track it. The other is there's a lot of these different workflow systems around. Rasky's one, RaskQ is another, Daisy is another, where You've got a driver, obviously what they're doing. You've got somebody who approves it. You've got the contributor who actually does it, and you've got the person that has to be informed. So you're defining these 4 roles in a job and who's going to do it. You can do some really sexy looking graphics that you can then trot out to the client as part of your project management, showing them exactly where they fit in, where everybody else in the team fits in. You'd obviously do this as part of the production planning process, and it'd have to be a large job, but it is a way of keeping track of who does what at what stage of the job. So it very clearly defines who's responsible for what. It's well worth an exercise to develop for those larger jobs, and where you know that producing it is actually going to help communicate within the business and also back to the client. Out of all of this, we've talked a lot about all of this, how it all revolves around computer system, software systems, recording hours, tracking. Underpinning it all in terms of the welfare of people working in the business, we need to keep hold of the idea, and I'm sure you all think this way. What we do is an art, and it requires reflection. So just put your head down and do it doesn't always work if you're trying to get a creative response. So reflection time has to be built into it. So when you're actually looking at all of these workflows and systems and all the rest, you need to build in there somewhere some time to spend reflecting on it. I know for myself, I'm working on something and I get stuck. I'll get up from the desk and walk around the block and come back and I've got an answer because I've gone off and reflected on it away from what I'm working on. I know it's necessary. And so I'm suggesting that you need to actually calculate that in as part of what you're doing. Here's an interesting concept. So that's 70% billable back to clients. If you really look at it, and this has come out of Trevor Hubbard at Butcher Shop. Take a look at him and his company. So he looked at what he's doing and said, let's actually plan our workplace around the people and what we're trying to get from them. And when he analysed it, and I think this is a really good analysis, 50% of the time was spent in production. So this is heads down, getting the work done, getting it out. 50% of the designer's billable hours is going into that. 20% is going into planning, which both of those, so the planning can be done in teams online. The 50% production can be done working from home. But the really interesting bit is what he calls play. 30% of it is you come into the studio, and what he noticed was that this 30% actually was where the interaction occurred. This is where we needed people together. People didn't have to interact that much in production. There was a very simple interaction in planning, but in what he calls play, this is the bit where we're brainstorming, we're working ideas through, we're collaborating on projects. So what he did was to actually refigure his studio. So instead of having rows and rows of desks, he's looked at spaces that are much more conducive to people sitting down together to discuss stuff. His report is that that's a much more productive way for him to work. I think it's an interesting concept. It's a great way to think about that flexibility, that, you know, the flexibility really is going to be determined by how much production you're doing, and how much of that can then be working from home, where you can allocate certain tasks to people. And if they choose to do it start at 10 o'clock because they've walked the dog, and finish it at 6 o'clock, so be it. But they're doing the work they're required to do in that production time. I think it's a very good way of thinking about improving productivity, but looking after the well-being as well. So how do we put all of this into place? How are we going to activate all of this sort of stuff? And you know, what are the implications? Well, we know that a 4-day week, for instance, is 1 hour extra billable per day per person. That's all it takes to offer a 4-day week. And you can pick up that billable by increasing your estimates. So you go back to your hourly cost rate figurings or calculations. You'd take a look at those and you would say, all right, we're actually going to only work 4 days a week instead of 48 weeks times 5, 48 weeks times 4, and look at the hourly rate that spills out. So you could do it that way, or you can do it by increasing efficiencies. So this is where things like your studio management software comes into play, where you can increase efficiency so people aren't hunting around trying to find the bits that they need. They're already there for them, or they've got a very clear understanding of what they're required to do, which has come out of the good briefing that they've got. So they actually do get more done in billings back to the client per day. The 9-day fortnight, I mean, and that's 25 minutes extra billable per day. That's a it's a lay down misère. There's no reason why you wouldn't offer that. You'd obviously put caveats on it around your heavy working times. And by the way, you're not going to offer all of these together. You're going to choose one or other of them, and that's going to be the sweetener that you're going to offer to people. One studio we heard from here in Melbourne did a 6-hour workday. So people would come in first thing in the morning. There was a set time. They would have a stand-up whip meeting. People would be allocated what they have to do. They'd then be 3 hours later, there'd be a get-together, another mini whip. How's it all going? What's working? What's not working? What do you need? And then they were knocked off by 4 o'clock and off home. So it gave them that time that for those things they wanted to do that were play for them. So perhaps it's going to galleries, it's off to the movies or whatever, but it gave them a much shorter day by being very focused during the time that they were in the studio. A similar sort of approach where you say to people, right, you're working from home 4 days a week, and that's our production time. You're working from here for 1 day a week where we're doing our planning sessions and we're doing all of the brainstorming and all of those sorts of things that we need to be able to do to further the jobs. So there's 4, and we know they actually have very little impact on productivity and the returns to the business. The other area is in things like paternity leave, with more than around about 60% of the Australian design workforce being women. This is an issue. So build it back into your costings. Assume it's going to happen. Build it back into your costings. And the same with menstrual leave. Build it back into the costings so that it pours out. All of those things are only going to add a few dollars per hour onto it. There's some other suggestions there as well, like long weekends, mandated, letting people work from anywhere for 4 weeks, setting up a sabbatical system where they can head off for 3 months without pay, but keeping their job. And then the high-end stuff like getting into profit share and employee-owned. So there's a whole lot of different ideas in there that relate to the idea of the well-being of people in the studio. So how do you action all of this? Well, the first thing is to look at that people and productivity. So how am I actually going to give the rewards to people that I've got working for me? What is it that is going to make them feel more productive? So looking at workflow, looking at the job systems I've got. And it's then also working out the appropriate rewards that you want to offer people. Build in a set of base rewards, then look at the top-ups like 9-day fortnights and what have you. Finally, then see how that all pours out in pricing. Now, do it as an exercise, look at the pricing. If you believe you're coming up with a figure that's too high for your clients, you need to go back and move back. So maybe there's a sharing of not just billing it all back to the client, but also trying to creep people up from 70 to 75%. Makes a huge difference. Just that 5% extra billable hours. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks very much.